In early 2007, rumors were surfacing around ATI's R600 and the monster specs that came along with it. It was to come in two variants, the HD 2900 XT and the HD 2900 XTX. Many hardware enthusiasts and ATI faithfuls were hoping for a Radeon 9700 Pro 2.0. After delays, ATI finally launched the HD 2900 XT in May of 2007, but the flagship HD 2900 XTX was missing. The XTX was intended to come with higher clock speeds than its little brother and a full gigabyte of GDDR4. Unfortunately, it never came to light as the unwieldy 12-inch card was sampled to a few, but it was never sold into the retail channels. GDDR4 supply and negligible performance increase was thought to be the reason why. Now back to the HD 2900 XT, those who were hoping for an 8800 GTX killer were sorely disappointed. On a positive note, the performance wasn't terrible, but it was only trading blows with the 8800 GTS 640, which was around $50 cheaper at the time. Despite its underwhelming performance, the HD 2900 XT is still a technical achievement. It was the first ATI card to support DX10 and use a unified architecture. It was also the first card to have a 512-bit memory interface, first to use an 8-pin PEC connector, first to implement a digital PWM on board, and first to use a dedicated hardware engine just for tessellation. Some of the card's biggest drawbacks were its high power consumption, loud cooler, lack of onboard UVD, weak texture fill rate and filtering performance, and its questionable methods of forcing MSAA to run on the shader hardware. So let's fast forward a couple months. ATI quietly releases the same card, but with 1GB of GDDR4. No, it wasn't the elusive XTX model, just the same XT, but with a mind-blowing amount of memory bandwidth, 128GB a second to be exact. To put that in perspective, that was as much memory bandwidth as a GTX 560, which came 4 years later. And as it happens to be, this is the card we'll be testing today. I purchased this card online, and it appeared to be in really good condition considering its age. I first removed the memory cooling plate on the back of the card and noticed the thermal pads were still in amazing condition. Moving on to the cooler, it's hard for me not to love this design. Yes, it reminds me of the Hot Wheels cars of my youth, but I love the cheesy and tackiness aesthetic. After removing the heatsink, I noticed that these thermal pads were also in great condition, and you'll also notice the heatsink is made primarily of copper. It looks as though the card was cleaned pretty well before I received it, and there was very little in the way of dust, so all I did was replace the thermal paste. As another interesting note, the 512-bit memory interface requires 16 memory modules to work, so we have 8 on the front and 8 on the back of the card. Alright, well in today's test we'll be looking at performance and frame times in 10 modern-ish games. The 2900 XT only supports up to DirectX 10, so our modern game choices are a bit limited. So while most of the games are a bit older, I still hope it provides some insight on how the card performs today. For our testing today, I also decided to overclock the 2900 XT using MSI Afterburner. There is a hard limit to its overclocking potential using the Catalyst Control Center and Afterburner. I will say there are tools available that will allow you to increase the voltage and unlock the official clock limits, but after seeing some results posted online, I decided it really wasn't worth it. Regardless, I was able to fully max out the sliders, and I saw an increase of 15% on both the core and memory clock speeds. Okay, well let's jump right into it. The first game we tested was CSGO, and at 1080p with medium settings with no AA, we saw an average frame rate of 64. Overclock, that number rose 12% to 72. Looking at the graph, you can see frame times were not great at all, as stutter is frequently felt in our 115-second capture. While the average frame rate is great, the overall experience is not without stutter. Next up is BioShock Infinite, and at 720p with the high preset, we averaged 41 frames per second. Overclock, that number jumped up 2% to 42, pretty much within a margin of error. This was tested multiple times, and it seems this game does not respond well to the overclocks from this card. Frame times were good, and the game ran pretty decently well at these settings. Metro Last Light Redux is up next, and using the built-in benchmark with medium settings, we averaged 34 frames per second. Overclock, that number increased 14% to 39. Frame times were great in our capture of the built-in benchmark, and even in our gameplay testing, the game looked great and played very well in my opinion. The second installment of The Witcher is up next, and since we can't play the third, this will have to do. Using the medium preset, we averaged 34 frames per second. Overclock, that number rose 8% to 37. We experienced a fair amount of inconsistent frame times, as shown in our graph. The good news is locking the frame rate 30 in Afterburner gave us some very consistent frame times, making the game a lot more enjoyable. The remake of Thief is up next, and at 720p with the very low preset, we averaged 24 frames per second. Overclock, that number increased 12% to 27. So during our run of the built-in benchmark, we saw several large spikes in our frame times. This was less than stellar, and at very low settings, sitting under 30 FPS, I wouldn't really call this a playable experience. GTA 5 is up next, and at 720p with no AA and 16x AF, we averaged 45 frames per second. Overclock, that number rose 11% to 50. We did experience some stutter here and there, but the game was very playable. I found myself forgetting that I was gaming on a 10-year-old video card, and while it didn't look great, the experience was solid overall, and I do believe having that 1GB of frame buffer helped us out as well. The 2013 version of Tomb Raider is up next, and using the built-in benchmark with the normal preset, we averaged 46 frames per second. Overclock, that number rose 15% to 53. We did experience some stutter at the start of our benchmark, but overall frame times were solid. The game still looks good with normal settings, and I find it to be very playable as well. Killing Floor 2 is up next, and using low settings with medium textures, along with FXAA, we averaged 59 frames per second. Overclock, that number jumped up 5% to 62. We did experience some inconsistent frame times here and there, but for the most part they were pretty solid. Like GTA 5, I found myself forgetting I was gaming on a 10-year-old card, and enjoyed getting my butt kicked many times. Next up is Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen. While this game was released on last-gen consoles in 2012, it was re-released on Steam in 2016. With the medium graphics preset and FXAA, we averaged 42 frames per second. Overclock, that number increased 9% to 46. We did experience some noticeable stutters in our 60-second capture, so this game would be another one to lock at 30 FPS for a console-like experience. The last game we tested was the original Dishonored, and at 1080p with high textures, normal model details, and everything else turned off, we averaged 54 frames per second. Overclock, that number rose 13% to 61. We did experience a handful of very noticeable stutters, and that's also reflected in our 1% and 0.1% lows. We did have a lot of the post-processing turned off, but it's still not a bad result for such an old card at 1080p. Now let's move on to our power consumption and temperature results. ATI chose to put silver flames on this card's cooler, so there's gotta be a reason for that, right? To test this, we fired up The Witcher 2 and let the card heat up to its max stabilized temperature. With the fan speed left on auto, we saw the 2900 XT hit 74C, while the whole system pulled 240 watts from the wall. If you were to factor in PSU efficiency, it's around 205 watts for the entire system. For our overclock result, we raised the fan speed to 69%, which is leaf blower loud by the way. We saw the card top out at 66-67C, while the whole system was pulling 256 watts from the wall. After factoring efficiency, the entire system was roughly using 217 watts. So looking at the temperatures and power consumption numbers, you can see the 2900 XT isn't that bad. Yeah, the power consumption numbers for its time were not great, but it certainly isn't unreasonable today. Fan speeds only topped out at 38% on auto, keeping the temperatures in check, but FYI, 38% fan speed on this cooler is not quiet. At 70 to 100% fan speed, it sounds like a Toro leaf blower, and it's actually quite comical. So wrapping things up, I'm actually impressed with the card's 720p performance in these AAA titles. While settings were nowhere close to being maxed out, it's still not a bad result for nearly a 10-year-old card with legacy drivers. Some titles were able to run at 1080p with decent results, but frame times were all over the place, so it wasn't a smooth experience. Having that 1GB of GDDR4 also helped out quite a bit in many of these games we tested as well. Newer, graphically less demanding games that were not shown, like Paladins, Path of Exile, Dota 2, and Rocket League, were all no problem for this card at 1080p with a mixture of settings. I can't fully explain it, but I have an odd attraction to this card and the history that surrounds it. So stick around because I'll be lining it up with its old nemesis, the 8800 GTX, and some newer titles. I'll also attempt some crossfire with these beauties to see how they'll perform. All this will be coming up in the coming months, so get subscribed if you haven't. And as always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. F2F out.